Hello. I want to start this video by declaring my deep and eternal allegiance to Jaru. Seriously, it's probably unhealthy how much I love Jaru's videos. I love his theatrics, I love his ideas, I love his writing. I've watched all of his Deltarune videos, except the 12-hour tier list one. I'm not brave enough. And I've probably rewatched his piles of Azrael's Dust theory 5 times at this point. Unironically, Rousey is piles of Azrael's Dust. I believe it. Give me it. Make it canon. But I don't know, I don't think I agree with Jaru's latest video about Deltarune's relationship with the player. It's a great video, don't get me wrong, but I don't agree with its conclusions, and I think that they separate us from some rich and interesting interpretations of Deltarune. Based on his tweets, it seems like Jaru's opinion may have shifted since making his video, or at the very least that he views it as more of a subjective discussion than an objective one. But I want to discuss the video itself, right? What the video is arguing. So when I talk about Jaru's opinions, that's just shorthand for his video's opinions. Okay? So I'm going to tell you why I disagree with Jaru's video, and then I'm going to detail the horrible crackpot theory that could come true if Jaru is wrong. And you're just going to have to deal with that, unfortunately. So, without further ado, hello, my name is Snarlinger, and today I'm talking about Deltarune. I nailed it. Let's start with a summary of Jaru's argument. I'm going to assume you've already watched the video, link in the description if you haven't, it's a great watch, we'll keep this short. Jaru's first big point is that Undertale blends its narrative and meta-narrative by overlapping meaning. Saving and loading is a game thing. Saving and loading is also an in-universe phenomenon. You're growing an unhealthy obsession with a game. So is this traumatized goat. Undertale builds and preserves a barrier between its narrative and meta-narrative. Jaru argues that this barrier is what preserves the player's suspension of disbelief. Suspension of disbelief is what allows us to connect with the story, because there's a real world here, right? With its own consistent internal logic that functions largely without us. Jaru doesn't spell this out until later, but if this barrier is broken, in other words, if the game becomes directly and inescapably aware that it is a video game, that suspension of disbelief is broken. Then Jaru speaks to Deltarune. Yay! From Jaru's perspective, some people have concluded that Deltarune will be all about how Chris is possessed by the player. Jaru argues that this conclusion is bad, right? If Chris is directly and inescapably being controlled by the player, this, quote, throws the entire regular narrative into the trash. In other words, and this is the big one, because our suspension of disbelief is broken, it is nigh impossible to recover, and we are unable to connect with the narrative anymore. Therefore, the barrier between narrative and meta-narrative must be preserved in Deltarune at all costs. Okay, so in typical Jaru fashion, he hits big with some of the points here, right? I love the observation that Undertale blends its narrative and meta-narrative by overlapping meaning. He hit on this point before, I think in his Gasterfiles video, and it instantly put to words what makes Undertale's story so rich and thoughtful and complex. I'm sure he isn't the first to make this point, but I heard it through him, and it rocked my world. I also really love Jaru's focus on storytelling techniques. I think it's really important to consider how stories function when interpreting media. Jaru is also obviously a storyteller at heart, right? That's not to say that his theories play second fiddle to story, his videos are not fanfiction, but that his theories are communicated through story. I mean, you see it in this video, right? Undertale's narrative structure is our ordinary world. A troubled interpretation of Chris's relationship with the player is our inciting incident. And by the end of our journey, we've restored the balance and discovered what is required for a story to connect with its audience. But it's that last part that kind of nags at me, right? The story that Jaru is telling here puts a lot of emphasis on requirements. To preserve a story's narrative, the story must preserve its suspension of disbelief. Deltarune, then, is required to preserve a barrier between its narrative and meta-narrative. And if it doesn't, chaos, right? Jaru says that would do horrendous damage to the game's reputation, that its quality would be called into question. It's an act of sabotage. But I have to ask, must Deltarune preserve this barrier? Jaru certainly thinks so. From what I can gather, he thinks so for two reasons. The first, I think, isn't central to his argument, but I think it's actually pretty interesting, so we'll knock this one out first. Deltarune is like Undertale. He never states it explicitly in the video, but you can kind of tell that he believes it, right? Jaru reveres Undertale. Rightfully, it's a great game. And Jaru rightly points out the numerous similarities between Undertale and Deltarune. He's done this before, right? His Piles of Azrael's Dust video finds strong similarities between Undertale and Deltarune and then tells a highly compelling story about their implications. And so, like Undertale, Deltarune must be building and preserving a barrier between its narrative and metanarrative. But of course, similarities don't always beget similarities, right? Deltarune isn't finished. It might not be like Undertale. When it's finished, we might realise that on a structural level, it was nothing like Undertale at all. Because of this, we can't assume that Deltarune is trying to preserve that barrier. Jaru also appeals to God King Toby Fox to make this argument. He argues that having a meta-narrative be an undeniable part of the regular plot is not how Toby Fox rolls. You actually see this a lot in the fandom, people assigning motives, desires, preferences to the god who hath given us life, right? So I actually think it's worth unpacking. How does Toby Fox roll? Do we really know? Toby Fox, to my knowledge, has made 4 games. Arn's Winter Quest, Earthbound Halloween Hack, Undertale, and 2/7 of Deltarune. The first 2 are Earthbound ROM hacks, and look, I admit that I haven't played them, but from online playthroughs, it seems that Arn's Winter Quest explicitly breaks the fourth wall multiple times, where Earthbound Halloween Hack doesn't really have much of a meta-narrative. But okay, these 2 games were made about a decade before Undertale, and Toby Fox has clearly evolved his craft since then. Accepting that, what are we left with? We're left with one complete game to understand Toby Fox. Undertale. I don't think that one game is enough material to know how Toby Fox rolls, right? If he wants to, at all costs, preserve the barrier between narrative and meta-narrative. Appealing to Toby Fox ends up just being another way of saying that Deltarune is like Undertale, and as I've said, I don't agree that that's necessarily the case. Okay, that's the first argument. His central argument, and you've probably already guessed it, is this. A broken barrier is a broken story. I'd argue that Jaru's proof of this largely rests on examples, right? I couldn't find an argument for this point in the video that didn't compare Deltarune to other works of media. And look, I think that's fair enough. It's really hard to prove what makes any narrative engaging or unengaging. So it's natural to point to other media and try to find patterns. As Jaru reasons, the Stanley Parable and I'm Scared break the barrier. Also, it's hard to suspend your disbelief while playing these games. Undertale, meanwhile, doesn't break the barrier, and it's very easy to suspend your disbelief while playing it. And so, quote, by not shoving the meta-narrative in our face, Toby avoids the downsides of having a meta-narrative. But there's an issue here, right? Because Jaru's argument relies on examples, if I find a game that breaks the barrier but doesn't break the player's suspension of disbelief, Jaru's argument falls apart. But look guys, I'm lazy and I'm a fake gamer, so luckily, Jaru found this game for me. From Jaru's perspective, Doki Doki Literature Club is deeply flawed. It has 2 hours of narrative at the front, and then in comes the meta twist. It's a video game, and Monica knows. This, by all accounts, breaks the barrier between narrative and meta-narrative, and accordingly, Jaru argues that this makes DDLC's narrative unimportant. It's a waste of time. In Jaru's words, it doesn't matter how fleshed out, likeable, or sympathetic the fictional characters are if the player's investment in that fiction has been undermined. And look, I agree in theory. If there was a game that completely undermined my investment in its fiction, I would feel cheated by that, right? I might even write off the story completely, question its quality, call whatever moment that undermined my investment in its fiction an act of sabotage. But look, DDLC is not that game, right? After playing it in full, my investment in the story, in the narrative, was stronger than ever. The reason is simple. It's those 2 hours of regular, dating sim-ass narrative that make you care about the story after the barrier is broken, right? If those 2 hours were scrapped and replaced with hyper-realistic eyes and stabbings and Monica staring lovingly into my eyes, you'd feel nothing, right? You care because of the characters. And so, accordingly, when I reflect on DDLC, my mind doesn't immediately go to the meta-narrative at all. It goes to Sayori, who struggled in silence, finally reaching out to a boy who held only a vacant concern for her suffering. It goes to Natsuki, abused by her father, who uses poetry to feel safe, innocent, and secure. And when I do dwell on the meta-narrative, I'm still thinking about these characters, right? I think of Monica, her loneliness, the hole inside of her yearning to connect with the only thing that feels real, the player. DDLC breaks the barrier. But here's the thing. My suspension of disbelief may have been shaken, but it was not broken. Okay, so hopefully I've done an alright job with my argument. If you agree with me, you'll agree that Deltarune is not necessarily like Undertale, and that a broken barrier does not necessarily equal a broken story. If you think that Deltarune is probably like Undertale, or that a broken barrier usually equals a broken story, or look, maybe you just don't like it when certain stories break the fourth wall, that's fine. I'm not interested in defining absolutes here, yet, only in creating a plausible bit of wiggle room. You should also agree that Jaru's videos are good, okay? He passionately and intricately defends his interpretations of Deltarune, and is entertaining to boot. That's a feat, man. It takes guts to bare your soul in front of thousands of people, still put on a great show, and respond to criticism as graciously as Jaru does. Way more guts than this video takes, anyway. But there's something missing, right? I've told you why Deltarune could break the barrier without breaking its story. I haven't told you why you should care, why you should want it to, why it will. Breaking the barrier, connecting with the story, breaking your suspension of disbelief and forgetting what these characters meant to you in the first place. Doesn't that all sound eerily familiar? Where have we heard of this before? You can go now. It's fine. It's just, this is going to be a bit vulnerable. Just a small transformation.
Darker yet darker grows my soul as a Deltarune theorist, germinated in rotten soil, cursed to care, to connect deeply, deeper with my beloved comfort characters. Chris, Susie, Noelle, Rousey, Spampton, the other Spampton, the egg guy, Gaster, also probably Gaster, maybe Gaster, the other Spampton. But what if... That's the question. What if Deltarune is bad? What if none of it really mattered at all? A waste. What am I doing with my life? How do I get out of this bit?
Oh, like that. Okay, hi. Here's a question. What is the barrier? No, not that barrier. This barrier. The one in Undertale. What is it doing? What's its deal? Well, on a narrative level, you could say that the barrier stops monsters from getting freedom. This is external freedom, the monsters going outside. It's also internal freedom, the monsters becoming their best selves, meaning Toriel becomes a teacher, Papyrus writes his dream card on the highway, Shiren sings on stage. To break the barrier and get freedom, 2 things need to happen. First, Frisk must demonstrate several good and lore-relevant character traits, right? Kindness, integrity, bravery, and so on. In other words, they must stay determined. Second, Asriel must give in, right? He needs to cry. He needs to connect with the world again. He needs to give away the one thing that he thought would make him happy. And so, thematically, the key to freedom in Undertale is faith and sacrifice. On a meta-narrative level, I'd argue that the barrier actually represents a separation between the player and the game. Now, for this to be true, if the barrier is broken, the player and the game should be connected, right? And this actually bears out. The barrier is not broken on a neutral route. It isn't broken on a genocide route either. The barrier is only broken on a true pacifist route. This is the route where Undertale has bared its beating heart, and given that you've stayed determined for this long, it's likely you have too. I'm crying as Ezreal destroys this barrier, right? Me and this game have become one at this point. Thematically, this feels oddly similar to the narrative's barrier. We have faith in the game. We see it through to the bitter end. It sacrifices itself for us, and we cry over its dead body. Okay, that's a bit dramatic, but I think you get the point. So, plotting these out on this diagram I stole, let me just rub these out. In Undertale, the barrier separates the underground from the surface. To break the underground, we need faith and sacrifice. Once we break it, we get freedom. Also in Undertale, the barrier separates the player from the game. To break the barrier, we need faith and sacrifice. Once we break it, we get connection. By overlapping these meanings, we get one of Undertale's rich, gooey, synthesized messages, right? To free ourselves, we need to connect to other people. And to connect to other people, we need to free ourselves. And all of this is marinated in these themes of faith and sacrifice. Okay, so why did I say all of that? Well, because you probably have me on in the background, and I can say anything I want. But also, it lays out a couple interesting themes, right? Freedom and connection. If you're as obsessed with Deltarune videos as I am, you've probably heard people talk about freedom and connection, right? These appear to be critical themes of Deltarune's story. And look, they might not be once it's finished, but for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to assume that they are. Deltarune is probably like Undertale a little bit, okay? What I want to argue here is that the similarities between Undertale and Deltarune's themes is no coincidence. Deltarune seeks to comment on Undertale. Most of all, it wants to complicate the idea of the suspension of disbelief. We're getting so close to fulfilling the promise of that thumbnail, guys. Just have faith. Before I continue, I want to set expectations. It's very hard to create a unified theory of Deltarune's themes. This is mainly because Deltarune isn't finished yet, okay? So I'm not going to give you a full, perfectly coherent theory about what Deltarune is. Instead, you should expect a compelling, evidence-based story that will help you connect more deeply with Deltarune. Personally, I eat up Deltarune theories, not to get to the objective truth, but because I want to immerse myself deeper within this game that I love, right? I want theories that help me dream. To start, let's look at that idea of freedom. What is freedom in Deltarune? Well, it's messy, okay? And I'd argue that unlike Undertale, Deltarune is deeply concerned with both narrative and meta-narrative freedom. Let's start with narrative freedom. In Undertale, freedom was very simple. There's the underground and the surface, and the monsters want to escape the underground for the surface. This was a good thing. In Deltarune, there's the dark world and the light world, and then we immediately hit our first snag. In the prophecy of Deltarune, if all the darkness were to leave for the light world, this would necessitate blanketing the world in darkness and initiating the Roaring, an apocalyptic event whomst is bad. So, can this freedom still be good? To answer this question, I'm going to mostly focus on Chapter 1. Spamton, and to an extent Queen, are relevant to this conversation, but I don't need them to make my point. Sorry. So, is freedom still good in Deltarune? Chapter 1 says, maybe not. In Chapter 1, we see a strange facsimile of Undertale's freedom. We have this Asgore-looking dude, King, who feels abandoned by the Lightners. He wants to gather power and create a world ruled by darkness. You kind of sympathize with him, right? Especially if you've played Undertale. But when we defeat King, something really weird happens. He becomes extremely docile. He's still resentful, but it's played as pathetic and funny. He's a hamster in a cage, and we no longer sympathize with his yearning for freedom. we can draw a comparison with Jevil. Jevil is in a cage too, but he thinks it is free. And in a sense, he's right. He doesn't have external freedom, but he does seem to have a twisted kind of internal freedom, especially when the Lightners enter his cage. And from his perspective, the Darkners may have external freedom, but by imprisoning Jevil, they lost their internal freedom. So, as Deltarune argues, feeling free actually has nothing to do with being free. And of course, at the end of chapter 1, we have this infamous scene, right? Chris gets freedom from the soul, and just like King and Jevil, the soul is caged. Chris's freedom in chapters 1 and 2 is depicted as inherently unnatural and threatening. Without the soul's influence, Chris moves like a sleepwalking corpse. They show their red creepypasta eyes, they wield knives, they cut off an escape route, and by summoning a dark fountain, they actually help bring about the roaring. Here, Deltarune suggests that freedom can be bad. It's afraid. What if we free something that's like really, really dangerous? Okay, so what about metanarrative freedom? Well, this ground is actually really well trodden, and there's things that I don't really need to elaborate on. Yeah, it goes without saying that the player's freedom, their ability to make meaningful choices, seems questionable in Deltarune. What I do want to draw attention to is where Deltarune deviates from this pattern, the weird route. Here, you break from the intended path in a way that kind of feels like you're breaking the game. You skip cutscenes, you go to areas you're not usually meant to access, and you kill off a character in a distinctly creepypasta way, yeah? And by doing this, you appear to give a twisted sort of freedom, quote unquote, to certain characters. You free a hidden power inside of Noelle. You free Birdley, where before the beads in the hospital march grimly along their set path, the blue bead is now broken and torn off. And you seemingly free something inside of Chris, a terrifying voice unlike anything Noelle has heard. Again, Deltarune is afraid of freedom. Okay, so let's take a step back, yeah? In both of these conceptions of freedom, there is competition. In the narrative, the Light World's freedom competes with the Dark World's. Jevil's freedom competes with the Kingdoms, and Chris's freedom competes with the Souls. And in the meta-narrative, our freedom competes with the narratives. For the narrative to have freedom to run its linear course, we must lose freedom, and vice versa. For Chris to be in control, we cannot, and vice versa. But let's think broader, right? It's not just our freedom competing with the narratives, it's the meta-narrative competing with the narrative. We're building a barrier. When this barrier is broken, we get something's freedom. And while the barrier may be separating many things, on a higher level, it's separating this: the narrative and the meta-narrative. Didn't have to rub anything out that time. I'm pretty awesome. I'm actually one of the smartest guys around right now. Okay, but how do we break this barrier? Well, I think we need connection. My thinking here is largely inspired by Spooky Dude's connection theory. It's a really good time, you should watch it if you haven't already, but where Spooky Dude uses connection to launch into a compelling discussion about memory, I'm going to interrogate that idea of connection a little bit more and integrate it with that idea of freedom. I'm going to argue that Deltarune is about suspending your disbelief to connect with things you have lost. Deltarune orbits around its main theme of don't forget. This song is about how, no matter how cold and dark it gets, even when familiar places feel distant and fake, something is still with you. This is a promise. Narratively, it's one that gestures to the game's theme of loss. Look at Noelle, right? Des is gone. Rudy is on the way out. If she had a good relationship with her mother, it's frozen over now. Look at Chris. Toriel and Asgore are divorced and Chris, a child, plays mediator. Azriel is gone, no more hot chocolate by the window. Chris and Noelle used to play, but things changed and they grew up. And how do we cope with loss? Well, I'd argue that we suspend our disbelief and imagine that the person we lost is still with us, right? A part of them became part of you. They watch over you. They're a spirit. They become funny coincidences, dreams, messages, right? And this is a kind of freedom, isn't it? It doesn't matter that I'm gone. I promise to always be there for you in the dark. Metanarratively, what else could this apply to but the suspension of disbelief? I've argued in this video that even if the barrier between narrative and metanarrative is broken, that connection can remain. So what if Deltarune breaks the barrier? What if we come to know that it's just a game, that it claims to know about us somehow? Well, if you're Jaru, you may be tempted to throw the narrative away. None of it mattered, right? It was all a story. But that belief, that power, what if it's still there? What if it's still shining in the cold, ready for us to wield it? Deltarune will ask us, just like Undertale, will you stay determined? Will you still suspend your disbelief, even when everything appears doomed? Don't forget is also a contract. Note how the theme takes on a different quality as it closes.
Don't forget, I'm with you in the dark.
It's up to you how to interpret this shift, but I get chills when I hear that final line, right? It sounds haunting. What is with us in the dark? Well, narratively, this is Gaster, right? Surely. Gaster may have seemingly exited the narrative, but pieces of him remain. He appears to be plotting something, or at the very least lying in wait, right? He is the piece of you that won't let go. The malevolent spirit, the false shepherd waiting for his sheep. Remember, I'll always be there in the dark, watching. On a meta-narrative level, well, if you installed Survey Program, you signed a contract. You accept everything that will happen from now on. In other words, you will suspend your disbelief. We believed in Undertale, and so we feel that we should believe in Deltarune. But Deltarune asks, what if that's a bad thing? What if Deltarune is the inverted Undertale, the Anglerfish's light, a facsimile? What if there is something in this game that is preying on us? Something that might prey on us in all fiction. It feeds on belief, on connection, and it wants to be set free. Why am I making this video? I don't know. I've been working on this video for I feel like it's been at least a month now. And I've been so immersed thinking about Deltarune that I've just been watching my health steadily decline. My RSI has been getting worse. I haven't been sleeping as well. I've been more anxious. I've developed this really, really stupid ritual where before I go to bed, before I can sleep, I need to look into the dark corners of my wardrobe to make sure that nothing is there. I feel like a child. I don't know what it is that I'm looking for. And at first, I was getting really worked up over this. I was like, what's the point of this stupid fucking video? People are going to hate this shit. You know, the fandom is in disarray. We're rotting. We haven't received a chapter for what feels like 500 years. And I feel like there's been more discourse about this game than there has been in the entire history of Deltarune. You know, I know Undertale had its fair share of controversies, but right now there's I don't know, man. It feels like there's a tension. One of the top posts on the Reddit the other day was we found out that the Gaster image was actually a picture of the ocean, which is really just so interesting. I just this is a really good way to kind of spend our time, isn't it? And it feels like for a lot of people, there's a lot at stake in Deltarune theory crafting. If your theory just doesn't really vibe with some people, you see it very recently with the Determinators, right? They received waves of transphobic harassment, some subtle, some very aggressive, for daring to theorize that the protagonists of these games are non-binary, right? And I think to a much lesser extent, you kind of see it with Jaru as well. Maybe not harassment, but certainly like a toxicity around his work, a smugness, an eagerness to dunk and nitpick and take him down a peg. Why? Right? Like, why? I get criticism of his theories, but why that tone? Where does that come from? Is that warranted? Is that healthy for a little theory crafting community like the one we have here? Like Jaru has, admittedly some pretty fucked up, crazy theories. But isn't that fucking cool? Like, do we not like that? Is that not good anymore? Like, do we not want crazy shit that makes us happy? That makes us think more deeply about this thing that we're fucking way, way too fucking obsessed with? Maybe it's the obsession that drives us to that. Maybe that connection with the game does something to us. But then what does that mean for me? Why do I feel like there's something hiding in the dark corners of this video? But then I remembered something. I believe in Deltarune, and my mission in making this video is to help you believe as well, right? I want you to immerse yourself deeper and deeper within this game that you love. I'm an emissary of light. I'm an emissary of Deltarune. Be not afraid. Be free. Be ready to suspend your disbelief for something greater than yourself and dream. So, without further ado,